It was the autumn of 1888, and £5,000 was a staggering fortune, enough to purchase a sprawling country estate, launch a fleet of merchant ships, or buy the absolute loyalty of a desperate soul. Alan Foster, the formidable Duke of Somerset, had precisely 4 problems, and they all wished to marry his only daughter. Determined to expose the fortune hunters hiding behind tailored tailcoats and rehearsed poetry, the Duke handed each suitor the immense sum with a simple instruction: "Show me what you value." He believed he was a master of human nature. But the Duke forgot one crucial variable in his grand experiment: a quiet, unassuming lady's maid named Nora. And what she purchased with that same sum would bring the powerful Duke to his knees. The Foster estate, known across England as Blackwood Manor, stood as a monolithic testament to centuries of wealth, power, and unapologetic privilege. Within its mahogany-panelled walls lived Alan Foster, the Duke of Somerset, a man carved from the rigid stoicism of the Victorian era. The Duke had spent his life expanding his family's empire, navigating the treacherous waters of the House of Lords and amassing a fortune that rivaled the Crown's. Yet for all his land and influence, his greatest vulnerability was his only child, Lady Cecily. Cecily was a rarity in high society, genuinely kind, disastrously naive, and cursed with a romantic heart fed by cheap penny dreadfuls and the honeyed lies of ambitious men. At 21, she was the most coveted heiress in London. The Duke knew that the men flocking to his drawing room cared little for Cecily's gentle spirit. They saw only the shadow of the Somerset fortune. By the end of the London season, 4 suitors had aggressively carved their way to the front of the pack, each presenting a flawless facade. First was Lord Richard Sterling, an earl's son with a pedigree as old as the Magna Carta. He possessed a dazzling smile and the infuriating arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Second was Sir Theodore Carmichael, a charismatic baronet and celebrated poet whose verses made Cecily blush and sigh. He spoke of love as if he had invented it, his eyes always shimmering with practiced sincerity. Third was Captain Frederick Hale, a decorated hero of the colonial wars. Broad-shouldered and stoic, he played the part of the honourable protector, captivating Cecily with tales of bravery on distant shores. Finally, there was Mr. Thomas Ashford, a rising industrialist. Though lacking a noble title, Ashford possessed a sharp, calculating mind and a rapidly growing railway empire. He represented the modern age, promising Cecily a life of unstoppable progress and luxury. The Duke despised them all. He saw the subtle, hungry gleam in Sterling's eyes when he looked at the estate's silver. He noticed how Carmichael's poetic declarations carefully avoided any mention of financial independence. He recognized the rigid, cold ambition masking Hale's supposed honor, and he saw the ruthless ledger behind Ashford's charming smile. Yet Cecily was entirely besotted. She begged her father to let her choose one of them, convinced that she was surrounded by the finest gentlemen in the empire. The Duke knew that forbidding the marriages outright would only drive his daughter to elope, a scandal he refused to entertain. He needed a way to make the men reveal their true natures. Watching from the periphery of this aristocratic circus was Nora Hayes. Nora was Cecily's personal lady's maid, a young woman of 24, whose quiet demeanour hid a razored intellect. Plucked from a dismal London orphanage a decade ago by the late Duchess, Nora owed her life, her education, and her survival to the Foster family. To the suitors, Nora was a ghost, a person who held coats, poured tea, and blended seamlessly into the wallpaper. but ghosts see everything. Nora noticed that Lord Stirling's expensive boots were cleverly resoled to hide their wear. She caught the scent of cheap gin beneath Sir Theodore's expensive French cologne. She saw Captain Hale violently kick a stable dog when he thought no one was looking, and she observed Ashford subtly pacing the dimensions of the drawing-room, calculating its square footage, as if preparing to auction it. One rainy Tuesday evening, the Duke sat in his cavernous study, staring into the roaring hearth. His solicitor had just left, leaving behind a stack of bank drafts. The Duke poured himself a heavy measure of brandy. The time for parlour games was over. It was time to gamble. The summons arrived at the lodgings of the 4 suitors the following morning. They were requested to attend the Duke in his private study at exactly 3 o'clock. When the men arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The dark oak walls of the study felt like a courtroom, and Alan Foster sat behind his massive desk like a presiding judge. Standing quietly in the corner, holding a silver tray with crystal glasses and a decanter of sherry, was Nora. The men did not so much as glance at her. "Gentlemen," the Duke began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that demanded absolute silence. "You have all made your intentions toward my daughter quite clear. Cecily is a jewel, the heir to the Somerset legacy. But a title and a fortune are heavy burdens. I must know that the man who stands beside her possesses not just charm, but character, prudence, and a vision for the future." The suitors puffed out their chests, each exchanging sidelong, competitive glances. The Duke opened a leather portfolio on his desk. Inside lay 4 separate envelopes, thick and heavy. "Words are cheap in London, gentlemen. Poetry can be memorized, war stories exaggerated, and pedigrees leaned upon. I deal in realities." He slid an envelope toward each man. "Inside each of these is a draft from the Bank of England for the sum of £5,000, the Duke announced. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Lord Stirling's hand twitched. Ashford's eyes went wide. £5,000 was a sum that could secure a man for life. It was an offensive amount of money to simply hand over. Consider this an early fraction of Cecily's dowry. The Duke continued smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. I am giving you this capital with no legal strings attached. You have 1 month. In that month I want to see what you do with this wealth. Show me your priorities. Show me your character. At the end of 30 days, you will return here and present to me what you have built, bought, or secured. The man who impresses me most will have my blessing to marry Cecily." The men were dumbfounded. They stumbled over themselves to thank the Duke, gripping the envelopes as if they contained the breath of life itself. Stirling's arrogant smirk returned. Ashford's eyes practically calculated interest rates on the spot. Carmichael looked ready to compose a sonnet to the banking system, and Hale gave a crisp, greedy salute. As they hurried out of the room to cash their windfalls, the study fell back into a heavy silence. The Duke let out a long, exhausted sigh and looked toward the corner of the room. "Well, Nora, what did you see?" Nora stepped forward, setting the silver tray down. "I saw 4 starving wolves handed a raw steak, Your Grace. They will not think of Lady Cecily, they will only think of their own hunger." The Duke offered a grim, approving smile. "My thoughts exactly. Men of weak character cannot survive sudden wealth. It burns a hole in their pockets and their morals. But I cannot be everywhere, Nora. I cannot follow them into the dark alleys and gentlemen's clubs of London." They will present a polished lie to me in 30 days. They will try, Your Grace, Nora said softly. The Duke opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a fifth envelope. It was identical to the ones he had just given the suitors. He held it out to her. Nora froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Take it, the Duke commanded gently. £5,000. Your Grace, I am a servant. I cannot accept. You are the only person in this house who loves my daughter as fiercely as I do. The Duke interrupted, his eyes burning with an intense, desperate light. You see the world from the shadows, Nora. You hear the whispers of the scullery maids, the coachmen, the valets. You have a network of eyes and ears that no aristocrat could ever buy. I am giving you this money not as a gift, but as a weapon. Nora slowly reached out and took the heavy envelope. Her hands trembled slightly. The sheer power contained within the paper felt like holding lightning. Use it to find the truth, the Duke ordered. Track them. Bribe whoever you must. Buy whatever evidence you need. And if by some miracle one of them proves worthy, so be it. But if they are the scoundrels we suspect, I want proof so absolute, so undeniable, that Cecily will see them for the monsters they are. The money is yours to execute this task. Do not fail me, Nora. Nora looked down at the envelope, then up at the towering Duke. I will not fail her, Your Grace. I will buy you the truth. The first week of the Duke's grand experiment played out exactly as Nora anticipated. The sudden injection of massive wealth did not elevate the four suitors. It simply magnified their existing flaws. But Nora did not rely on assumptions. With £5,000 at her disposal, she became the quiet architect of their undoing, utilizing the invisible army of London, the working class. Nora began by converting a small portion of the funds into crisp £5 notes and shillings. She knew that a nobleman's secrets were only as secure as his servant's silence. She started with Lord Richard Sterling. To Lady Cecily, Sterling claimed he was using the Duke's money to restore his family's ancestral estate in Yorkshire, preparing it to be a palace fit for a duchess. Nora, dressed in a plain brown cloak, met with Sterling's disgruntled head groom in the back room of a smoky tavern in Mayfair. For the price of £50, a life-changing sum for the groom, Nora purchased a ledger the man had stolen from Sterling's private desk. The truth was grotesque. Sterling was entirely bankrupt, his family estate heavily mortgaged to ruthless moneylenders. He hadn't spent a single penny on restoring his home. Instead, he had taken the Duke's £5,000 straight to the underground gambling hells of Soho, desperate to win back his lost fortune at the baccarat tables. He had paid off violent bookmakers to save his own knees from being broken, and he had already lost another £1,000 on fixed horse races. Sterling was not building a palace. He was plugging the holes of a sinking ship. Next was Sir Theodore Carmichael, the romantic poet. He had sent Cecily a letter claiming he was investing the money into a publishing house, ensuring his poetry and their love would be immortalized in print. Nora did not need to go far to uncover his lie. She simply bought the loyalty of the madam at an exclusive, highly discreet brothel in Covent Garden. For £300, the madam handed Nora a stack of receipts and a key. Carmichael had indeed rented a property, but not a publishing house. He had purchased a lavish, secretive townhouse for his long-term mistress, a Parisian cabaret dancer. He was outfitting the love nest with fine silks and imported wines, all paid for by the Duke's dowry. To Carmichael, Cecily was merely a bank, while his true passions lay hidden across the city. Captain Frederick Hale proved slightly more challenging. The stoic war hero had told the Duke he was using the funds to establish a charitable foundation for wounded soldiers returning from the colonies. Nora travelled to the grim docks of the East End. She paid a handsome sum to a retired, one-armed sergeant who had served under Hale. Over a pint of dark ale, the old soldier spat on the floor at the mention of Hale's name. Hale had not started a charity. Instead, he had used the £5,000 to quietly buy shares in a notorious unregulated munitions company that sold weapons to both the British Army and the enemy insurgents. Hale was a war profiteer, perfectly willing to fund the deaths of his own countrymen to line his pockets. Furthermore, the old sergeant revealed that Hale had bought his medals of valor by bribing superior officers, having never actually seen the front lines himself. Finally, there was Mr. Thomas Ashford, the charismatic industrialist. Ashford was the most cunning of the lot. He had proudly shown the Duke forged documents proving he was investing the £5,000 into a new revolutionary railway line that would connect the Foster estates directly to London, seemingly a brilliant move to enrich the Duke's family. Nora knew better than to trust paper. She hired one of the most ruthless private investigators in London, an ex-Scotland Yard detective named Mr. Vance. An ex-detective named Mr. Allen. No, let us call him Mr. Charles Higgins. For a staggering fee of £500, Higgins infiltrated Ashford's corporate offices. The reality of Ashford's plan was a masterpiece of corporate theft. The railway line was indeed real, but Ashford was not building it to enrich the Duke. He was using the £5,000 to quietly buy up all the critical surrounding land and water rights just outside the Duke's borders. Once the railway was built, Ashford would possess a complete monopoly over the region's transport, effectively allowing him to choke the Duke's estates, extort the Foster family, and forcefully take over their agricultural businesses. Ashford wasn't courting Cecily. He was executing a hostile takeover of the Duke's entire empire from the inside. By the end of the third week, Nora sat alone in her small, sparsely furnished room at the top of Blackwood Manor. Spread out on her simple wooden bed were the ledger of a gambling addict, the townhouse deed of a philanderer, the munitions shares of a coward, and the monopoly blueprints of a corporate shark. She had uncovered them all. She had protected Lady Cecily. The Duke would be thrilled. But as Nora looked down at the remaining money, nearly £4,000 still sat untouched in her iron lockbox. A cold, profound realization washed over her. Exposing the men was only half the battle. If she simply handed the papers to the Duke, Cecily would be heartbroken. Cecily would believe that all men were monsters, that love was a lie, and her spirit would be crushed. Worse, the aristocracy would simply close ranks. The suitors would deny the evidence, blame it on a vindictive servant, and society would believe the lord's over the lady's maid. The Duke might believe her, but the public scandal would humiliate Cecily anyway. Nora realized that merely exposing their lies wasn't enough. She needed to trap them. She needed to buy something so undeniable, so physically shocking, that the suitors would have no choice but to confess in front of everyone, destroying their own facades in a way that left Cecily feeling empowered rather than victimized. She stared at the stacks of banknotes. She had £4,000 left. What could a maid buy with an aristocrat's ransom that would bring 4 powerful men to their knees? Nora's eyes narrowed as a brilliant, dangerous idea formed in her mind. She gathered the money, packed a small valise, and prepared to return to the darkest corners of London. She was no longer just an observer. She was about to become the orchestrator of the greatest scandal high society had ever witnessed. To expose a lie, one must simply shine a light. To destroy a liar, one must make them hold the lantern. Nora understood that if she presented paper evidence to Alan Foster, the Duke of Somerset, he would quietly dismiss the suitors to protect his daughter from public humiliation. Lord Richard Sterling, Sir Theodore Carmichael, Captain Frederick Hale, and Mr. Thomas Ashford would slink away into the London fog, their reputations intact, ready to victimize another wealthy, unsuspecting family. Worse, Lady Cecily would be left bewildered, told only that her beloved suitors were unsuitable, leaving her to pine for the men she thought were perfect gentlemen. Nora needed a spectacle. With precisely £4,000 remaining in her iron lockbox, she set out to purchase the physical manifestations of their sins. Her first destination was the soot-stained labyrinth of Soho. She sought out a man known only as Silas O'Malley, a ruthless subterranean bookmaker who held the gambling debts of half the aristocracy. O'Malley operated out of a butcher's shop, where the stench of raw meat mingled with the sour scent of stale gin and desperation. Nora did not flinch when O'Malley's massive, scarred enforcer blocked her path. She simply opened a velvet pouch and withdrew a stack of pristine Bank of England notes. For the sum of £1,200, Nora purchased every single outstanding promissory note and gambling marker bearing Lord Richard Sterling's signature. She was no longer just a maid. She was now the legal owner of an earl's son. If Sterling did not pay her, she had the legal right to seize his ancestral estate or have him thrown into the brutal confines of Fleet Debtors' Prison. Next, Nora turned her attention to Sir Theodore Carmichael and his Parisian mistress, Mademoiselle Geneviève Dubois. Nora knew that Carmichael was a coward who kept his 2 lives strictly separated. She needed to force those lives to collide. Posing as a senior event coordinator for the Duke of Somerset, Nora visited the lavish Covent Garden townhouse Carmichael had rented. She found Geneviève reclining on a chaise lounge, surrounded by expensive silks bought with the Duke's money. Nora presented the dancer with a beautifully embossed invitation to a grand patron's gala at Blackwood Manor. She spun a brilliant fiction telling Geneviève that Sir Theodore was publicly unveiling her as his muse to the highest echelons of British society. Flattered and blinded by ambition, the dancer eagerly accepted. To ensure the trap was inescapable, Nora spent £800 to quietly buy the actual deed to the Covent Garden townhouse from the original landlord, registering it under the Duke's holding company. Captain Frederick Hale's treasonous greed required a different approach. Hale had invested his £5,000 into the Ironclad Foundry, a shadow company producing illegal munitions. Nora could not buy the company, but she could buy its inventory. She travelled to the industrial smog of the Docklands and met with the foundry's corrupt foreman. Under the guise of an anonymous international buyer, Nora spent £1,000 to purchase 24 heavy wooden crates of the illegal, unmarked rifles. But she did not arrange for them to be shipped overseas. Instead, She paid the freight drivers an extra £50 to deliver the towering crates directly to the cobblestone courtyard of Blackwood Manor, on the exact day the suitors were due to return, labelling the shipment as a generous charitable donation from Captain Hale. Finally, there was Mr. Thomas Ashford, the corporate shark. Ashford had used the Duke's money to buy up all the land surrounding the Duke's estate, planning a railway monopoly that would slowly choke the Foster family into submission. But Ashford, in his arrogant haste, had relied on outdated county maps. Nora spent 3 sleepless nights poring over the newest geographical surveys at the London archives. She found a flaw in Ashford's ironclad net. There was a tiny 50-yard strip of rocky terrain known as Miller's Gorge, an old, dried-up riverbed that intersected the exact path Ashford's railway had to cross to reach the main commercial hub. It was owned by a destitute sheep farmer named Horace Miller. Nora rode out to the countryside and sat at the wobbly wooden table of the Miller family. For £500, a fortune that made the old farmer weep with gratitude, Nora purchased the deed to the gorge. She registered the land under a blind trust, controlled entirely by Lady Cecily. Ashford had spent £5,000 building a sprawling monopoly, but Nora had spent £500 to buy the lock to his front door. Without Miller's Gorge, Ashford's railway led absolutely nowhere. With £500 left for emergencies, Nora returned to Blackwood Manor. Her traps were set. The pieces were moving. All that remained was for the players to take their seats at the table. The 30th day arrived with a heavy, bruised sky that threatened a torrential downpour. Inside Blackwood Manor, however, the atmosphere was electric. The grand dining hall had been prepared for a lavish feast. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over silver candelabras and pristine white damask tablecloths. Lady Cecily was vibrating with innocent excitement. She wore a breathtaking gown of emerald silk, her hair pinned up with diamonds that caught the light with every nervous turn of her head. She believed tonight was the night she would become engaged to a man of honor, poetry, bravery, or progress. "Oh, Papa," Cecily whispered, clutching the Duke's arm as they waited in the drawing room. "Do you think they have succeeded? Do you think they have built wonderful things?" Alan Foster looked down at his daughter, a pang of sorrow tightening his chest. He patted her hand gently. "We shall see, my dear. A man's true worth is rarely found in his promises. It is found in his ledgers." The Duke glanced toward the heavy oak doors. Standing in the shadows, perfectly still and completely unreadable, was Nora. She wore her standard black maid's uniform, a stark contrast to the opulence of the room. She offered the Duke a single imperceptible nod. The suitors arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, each stepping out of their carriages with the polished confidence of men who believed they had successfully outsmarted a Titan. Lord Richard Sterling was the first to enter, flashing his dazzling, aristocratic smile. Sir Theodore Carmichael followed, looking appropriately tortured and artistic in a velvet smoking jacket. Captain Frederick Hale marched in with military precision, his chest puffed out, while Mr. Thomas Ashford brought up the rear, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the room, assessing its value. Dinner was a masterful display of psychological tension. The Duke played the role of the gracious host, pouring expensive wine and offering mild, encouraging questions. The suitors, emboldened by the alcohol and the Duke's apparent gullibility, began to weave their elaborate lies. "The estate in Yorkshire is nearly restored to its former glory, Your Grace," Sterling boasted over a plate of roasted pheasant, raising his glass. The £5,000 allowed me to hire the finest stonemasons in England. I look forward to the day Lady Cecily can walk its historic halls. How wonderfully traditional, Carmichael interrupted smoothly, eager to steal the spotlight. But history is in the past. I have invested in the future of the human soul. My new publishing house is already securing the finest literary talents in Europe. A beacon of art, funded by your generous dowry, Your Grace. Captain Hale cleared his throat loudly. Art is fine for peacetime, but the men who bled for this country need practical help. My foundation for wounded veterans has already broken ground on a new hospital wing in the city. Duty, Your Grace. That is what I built. Ashford offered a patronizing chuckle. Stonemasons, poetry, and charity, all very noble, but wealth must generate wealth. My railway line is fully funded and the land secured. It will double the Foster estate's export capabilities within the year. A practical marriage of our two great houses. Lady Cecily beamed at them all, her heart overflowing with pride. She looked at her father, expecting him to be thoroughly impressed. The Duke dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin and placed it deliberately on the table. The subtle clinking of silver abruptly stopped. The silence in the dining hall grew suddenly heavy, thick with an unspoken threat. Stonemasons, publishing houses, hospitals, railways, the Duke repeated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the mahogany walls. He leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking onto each man in turn. You have all been terribly busy. We aimed to impress Your Grace, Sterling said, though his smile faltered slightly under the Duke's icy glare. Oh, you have impressed me, Lord Sterling, the Duke replied softly. But as I told you a month ago, words are cheap. Tonight is the night for realities. The Duke turned his head toward the corner of the room. Nora. The four suitors barely registered the name. To them, the maid was part of the furniture. But as Nora stepped out of the shadows and into the golden light of the chandelier, carrying a heavy, leather-bound portfolio, a strange unease rippled through the men. Gentlemen, the Duke announced, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. I have not been idle this past month. I asked my most trusted associate to audit your magnificent investments. An audit? Ashford bristled, his corporate instincts flaring. Your Grace, I assure you, my ledgers are perfectly quiet. The Duke snapped, the word cracking like a whip. He gestured to the maid. Nora, if you please, let us begin with Lord Sterling's historic stonemasons. Nora walked calmly to the table. She did not look like a servant anymore. She moved with the terrifying precision of an executioner. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of grimy, beer-stained parchment papers. She walked up to Lord Sterling and dropped them directly onto his porcelain plate. What is the meaning of this? Sterling demanded, his face flushing with anger. Those are Lord Sterling, Nora said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly across the silent room. Are your gambling markers. 62 separate promissory notes purchased from Mr. Silas O'Malley in Soho, totaling exactly £4,800. You did not hire stonemasons. You lost His Grace's money at the baccarat tables, and you used the rest to keep your bookmakers from breaking your legs. Sterling went completely pale, his jaw dropping, as he stared at his own frantic, desperate signatures on the IORs. Furthermore, Nora continued relentlessly, as the legal holder of these debts, I have initiated the paperwork to seize your Yorkshire estate by the end of the week, as it was listed as collateral. You are completely bankrupt, my lord." Cecily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Richard, is this true?" Sterling tried to speak, but only a pathetic, suffocated stammer escaped his lips. The illusion of the wealthy aristocrat shattered instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, ruined gambler. Before the shock could fully settle, a loud commotion erupted in the grand foyer outside the dining hall. The heavy oak doors were suddenly thrown open by a bewildered footman. "Your Grace, I apologize, but there is a woman here who insists she is the guest of honor." Striding into the dining hall was Mademoiselle Geneviève Dubois. She was dressed in an ostentatious, plunging gown of crimson velvet, dripping with cheap jewels and reeking of heavy Parisian perfume. "Theodore, mon amour," Geneviève cried out joyfully, spotting Carmichael at the table. She ran toward him, completely ignoring the Duke and the horrified Lady Cecily. "I am here. I received the invitation. Are we announcing our love to the Duke now?" Sir Theodore Carmichael looked as though he had been struck by lightning. He violently pushed his chair back, scrambling away from the dancer. "Geneviève! What? How did you get here? Get away from me!" Nora stepped forward, producing a crisp, legal deed. She received an invitation to the townhouse, Sir Theodore, the townhouse you rented for her in Covent Garden with the Duke's money. However, you will need to find her new lodgings by morning. His Grace has purchased the property out from under you. Your publishing house is officially closed." Cecily burst into tears, the devastating reality of Carmichael's betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. The romantic poet was nothing but a fraud, funding his secret infidelities. The Duke's face was a mask of cold fury. "Two down. Let us see the rest of your magnificent creations." Captain Frederick Hale, witnessing the absolute destruction of his two peers, stood up so violently his chair crashed to the polished hardwood floor. The stoic facade of the colonial war hero dissolved into a mask of ugly, cornered panic. He pointed a trembling, thick finger at Nora. "This is a farce," Hale bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You take the word of a common servant and a French harlot over a decorated officer of the crown? I have shed blood for the Empire. My hospital wing is already being built." Nora did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned her gaze to the large bay windows that overlooked the manor's cobblestone courtyard. "Right on time," Nora whispered. Before the Duke could question her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of draft horses and the grinding of iron-rimmed wagon wheels drifted into the dining hall. The sounds were accompanied by the shouts of teamsters echoing through the rain-slicked night. "If you look out the window, Captain Hale," Nora said calmly, "you will see your hospital wing arriving." Frowning, the Duke stood and marched to the glass, pulling back the heavy velvet drapes. Cecily, wiping away her tears, timidly followed. In the courtyard below, illuminated by the flickering gas lamps, sat 3 massive freight wagons. Several burly dockworkers were already unlatching the heavy wooden crates stacked high in the carts. One of the crates had cracked open during the journey, spilling its contents onto the wet stones. They were not bandages. They were not medical supplies. They were gleaming, unmarked Enfield rifles. "The ironclad foundry," Nora stated, her voice slicing through the horrified silence of the room. "An unregulated shadow munitions company in the East End that sells weaponry to insurgents and enemies of the Crown. I purchased this inventory using an anonymous alias and your name as the benefactor, Captain." The dock workers believe they are delivering a charitable donation. However, the Bow Street runners, whom I sent an anonymous tip to 3 hours ago, will recognize them as high treason. Hale's face drained of all colour. The veins in his neck bulged as he looked from the window to the maid, realizing the lethal trap she had sprung. Treason did not mean bankruptcy or social ruin. It meant the gallows. You insignificant little witch, Hale hissed, taking a threatening step toward Nora. Before he could close the distance, the Duke of Somerset moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. He stepped between his maid and the soldier, his towering frame casting a massive shadow over Hale. "Take another step toward her, Hale," the Duke growled, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "And I will not bother waiting for the authorities. I will execute you on my own Persian rug." Hale swallowed hard, the remaining false bravery evaporating from his eyes. He backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. 3 suitors were utterly ruined. Only Mr. Thomas Ashford remained. The industrialist had watched the carnage with a chilling, detached fascination. As Hale retreated to the corner, Ashford calmly took a sip of his wine, straightened his perfectly tailored cuffs, and offered a slow, patronizing clap. "Bravo, Your Grace," Ashford said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "A brilliant theatrical performance, exposing the gambler, the philanderer, and the traitor. It seems I am the only genuine gentleman at this table." He offered Cecily a sympathetic, victorious smile. "Do not weep, my lady. You are rid of the chaff. The wheat remains." Ashford turned his arrogant gaze toward Nora. "You have played the spy beautifully, little bird, but you cannot touch me. My ledgers are perfectly legal. My railway is fully funded. The land is legally secured under my holding company. There are no harlots, no gambling debts, and no illegal rifles in my closet. My £5,000 has been spent exactly as I promised, building an empire. An empire designed to choke the Foster estates into submission," Nora corrected smoothly. "By purchasing all the surrounding water rights and transport lanes, you intended to create a monopoly, extort the Duke, and take his agricultural businesses by force." Ashford chuckled, a cold, reptilian sound. "Perhaps. But it is perfectly legal business, my dear. I outsmarted the Duke. When the railway is complete, he will have no choice but to rely on my trains. It is a brilliant strategy, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. The steel is already being forged." Nora opened her leather portfolio for the final time. She pulled out a single, unpretentious piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges. "You are a very thorough man, Mr. Ashford," Nora said, walking toward him. "You bought hundreds of acres. You bribed surveyors. You outmaneuvered the local magistrates, but you relied on the county maps from 1875. Ashford's smug smile faltered a fraction of an inch. "What are you talking about?" "The floods of 1881 shifted the topography of the western boundary," Nora explained, dropping the parchment onto Ashford's lap. "You require a perfectly straight path to connect your railway to the London commercial hub. To do that, your tracks must cross a 50-yard strip of rocky, dried-up riverbed known as Miller's Gorge." Ashford looked down at the deed, his eyes scanning the legal script with a sudden frantic intensity. "3 days ago," Nora continued, "I rode out to see a destitute sheep farmer named Horace Miller. For the sum of £500, I purchased Miller's Gorge. The land does not belong to your company, Mr. Ashford, and it never will. I will buy it from you." Ashford snapped, his composure finally cracking as he realized the catastrophic flaw in his grand design. "I will give you 10 times what you paid." "You cannot buy it from me," Nora said softly, her eyes locking onto his with absolute triumph. "Because I do not own it." She gestured toward the weeping young woman at the end of the table. "I registered the land under an ironclad, blind trust. The sole beneficiary and controller of Miller's Gorge is Lady Cecily Foster. Without her explicit, written permission, your trains cannot move an inch. You spent £5,000 to build an empire, Mr. Ashford, but Lady Cecily owns the gates." Ashford sat frozen, the breath knocked out of his lungs. The corporate shark had been gutted by a 50-yard strip of dirt. His investors would ruin him when they realized his multi-million-pound railway led to a dead end. He looked at the quiet, unassuming Maid, his mind failing to comprehend how he had been outplayed so thoroughly. "Checkmate," the Duke whispered, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. The expulsion of the 4 suitors was not a dignified retreat. It was a chaotic, spectacular unraveling. The grand illusion they had each meticulously crafted over the past month shattered the moment it met the cold, unyielding floor of reality. Lord Richard Sterling was the first to break. The arrogant Earl's son, who had spent the evening boasting of his ancient lineage, scrambled backward from the dining table, as if the grim, beer-stained gambling markers Nora had dropped were made of hot coals. He did not wait for his carriage to be brought around. Terrified that Silas O'Malley's ruthless debt collectors were already waiting in the shadows of the Manor's gardens, Sterling bolted. He sprinted through the heavy oak doors and out into the torrential rain, his expensive, resoled boots slipping on the wet cobblestones as he vanished into the dark, a ruined man fleeing his own shadow. Sir Theodore Carmichael's departure was infinitely louder. Mademoiselle Geneviève Dubois, realizing she had been used as a pawn in a humiliating public spectacle, turned her fiery Parisian temper entirely upon the poet. "You promised me Paris. You promised me society," she shrieked, striking him repeatedly about the shoulders with her beaded reticule. Carmichael, desperate to salvage any shred of his dignity, tried to shush her, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt to ward off her blows. He was practically chased down the grand staircase and out the front doors, the romantic poet reduced to a cowering scoundrel fleeing his own secret life. Captain Frederick Hale, however, did not go willingly. The stoic war hero, realizing the lethal trap closing around him, attempted to draw upon his military authority. "You cannot do this. I am an officer of the crown," he bellowed, his face a mask of ugly, cornered rage. But the Duke's private estate guards, broad-shouldered men who harbored no love for corrupt officers, were already moving in. They seized Hale by the arms, entirely ignoring his frantic, treasonous protests. They hauled him out the servants' entrance, dragging him through the mud to where the local constabulary was already waiting by the wagons of illegal rifles. Hale's military career, and very likely his life, ended in the soaking downpour of the Blackwood courtyard. And finally, there was Mr. Thomas Ashford. The industrialist did not run, nor did he scream. He simply stood up from the table, his movements slow and mechanical. The corporate shark had been gutted, his multi-million-pound empire reduced to dust by a 50-yard strip of dried-up riverbed. He stared blankly at the far wall, his sharp mind desperately running through legal loopholes and financial ledgers, only to find the same catastrophic dead end every time. He walked out of the dining hall in a numb, devastated daze, forgetting his hat and his tailored overcoat, stepping out into the freezing rain as a man whose entire existence had just been erased by a maid. When the heavy oak doors finally clicked shut, sealing the tempest outside, the grand dining hall felt cavernous and profoundly still. The only sounds were the violent drumming of the rain against the bay windows, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, and the soft crackle of the hearth. Lady Cecily sat motionless at the long table. Her breathtaking gown of emerald silk suddenly felt heavy, like a foolish theatrical costume worn for a play that had been violently cancelled. She looked at the 4 empty chairs. She looked at the half-eaten roasted pheasant, the crystal glasses of spilled claret bleeding into the pristine white damask tablecloth, and the scattered damning documents that had saved her life. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward the corner of the room. Nora stood there perfectly still, her hands neatly folded over her plain black maid's apron. She had retreated back into her quiet, unassuming posture, but the air around her hummed with a quiet, terrifying power. Cecily stood up. The diamond hairpins caught the flickering candlelight, casting fractured rainbows across the mahogany-panelled walls. She walked past her towering father, past the silver candelabras, and stopped directly in front of her lady's maid. The rigid social boundaries that dictated every interaction in Blackwood Manor seemed to evaporate in the space between them. For a long, breathless moment, the 2 young women simply looked at one another. The sheltered, wealthy aristocrat who had nearly surrendered her future to a lie, and the orphaned, working-class girl who had ruthlessly dismantled it. Without a word, Cecily closed the distance. She threw her arms around Nora's neck and wept. It was not a quiet, dignified weep of a lady suffering a broken heart. It was a deep, overwhelming, shuddering sob of profound gratitude. It was the physical release of a woman realizing exactly how close she had come to stepping off a precipice into an abyss. "Thank you," Cecily whispered fiercely into Nora's shoulder, her fingers gripping the coarse fabric of the maid's uniform, as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. "Thank you for seeing what I was too blind to see." Nora slowly raised her arms, gently returning the embrace. Her own eyes grew misty, the adrenaline of the evening finally ebbing away to leave a deep, abiding affection for the girl she had watched grow up. "You are not blind, my lady," Nora murmured softly, her voice steady and reassuring. "You simply look for the good in people. You expect the world to be as honest as you are. It is not a flaw to have a kind heart. It is only a flaw to let wolves mistake it for weakness. Tonight, you showed them that you are not prey." Alan Foster, the formidable Duke of Somerset, stood by the hearth and watched the embrace. His chest tightened with a heavy, unfamiliar emotion. He had spent his entire life accumulating raw power, navigating the treacherous political waters of the House of Lords, expanding a financial empire, ruthlessly crushing his rivals. Yet as he looked at his daughter weeping in the arms of a servant, he realized the stark limits of his wealth. He had been prepared to hand Cecily over to monsters. He had failed to protect her. It was the quiet girl in the shadows who had built the fortress he could not. He cleared his throat softly, turning to pour himself a fresh, heavy measure of brandy from the crystal decanter to steady his fraying nerves. "Cecily, my dear," the Duke said gently, his gravelly voice remarkably tender. "Go to your rooms. Rest now. The storm is over. Tomorrow we will begin anew, and we will do so without the vultures circling our home." Cecily nodded, pulling back and wiping her face. She offered Nora one last, desperate squeeze of her hand, a silent vow of eternal gratitude, before turning and quietly leaving the dining hall. The rustle of her silk skirts faded down the long, echoing corridor. When they were truly alone, the Duke walked slowly toward the head of the table. He picked up Nora's leather-bound portfolio, marveling at the sheer weight of the secrets it had contained. He ran his calloused thumb over the worn leather, his sharp, analytical mind instantly transitioning from a father back to a tactician. "You spent £1,200 on the gambler's markers," the Duke calculated aloud, reviewing the ledger of destruction from memory. "800 on the townhouse deed in Covent Garden, 1,000 on those treasonous rifles sitting in my courtyard, and 500 on that strip of dried riverbed, Miller's Gorge." He looked up, his piercing, icy blue eyes locking directly onto Nora's calm, unblinking gaze. "That is £3,500, Nora," the Duke stated, his tone businesslike, yet laced with intense curiosity. "I gave you an envelope containing exactly 5,000. There is still £1,500 unaccounted for. What did you do with the rest of the money?" Nora did not hesitate. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and withdrew 2 crisp, folded documents, sealed with heavy red wax. She walked to the table and placed them carefully onto the polished wood, right beside the Duke's glass of brandy. "When I was investigating these men in the city, Your Grace, I realized something terrifying," Nora began, her voice dropping to a quiet, earnest register that demanded absolute attention. "I realized that exposing them in this room was only half the battle. High society is inherently ruthlessly cruel to women. If word leaked out that 4 prominent, well-connected gentlemen had been banished from Blackwood Manor on the same night, the rumour mills would not blame the men. They would close ranks. They would whisper that Lady Cecily was flawed, or difficult, or perhaps terribly compromised. The scandal would ruin her prospects, her reputation, and her spirit, even though she is the entirely innocent victim." The Duke frowned, his jaw clenching. The harsh truth of her words stung, precisely because he knew she was absolutely correct. The aristocracy was a vicious, protective beast that always devoured the vulnerable. "Go on." "I needed to ensure that these men would never, ever speak a word of what happened here tonight," Nora explained, her eyes darkening with a fierce, protective fire. "They must leave quietly, and they must publicly claim to their peers that they were the ones who fell short of your grand expectations. They must protect Lady Cecily's reputation with their own absolute silence." The Duke pointed a heavy finger at the folded documents on the table. "And how exactly does a lady's maid buy the silence of an earl's son, a celebrated poet, and a ruthless industrialist?" "By buying the loudest voice in the room," Nora replied smoothly. She reached out and tapped the first document with her index finger. "For the sum of £1,000, I purchased a controlling 80% share in the printing presses, distribution networks, and publishing rights of the Mayfair Whisperer, the most vicious, widely read, and feared society gossip newspaper in all of England. It is now legally owned by an anonymous blind trust that I alone control." The Duke's eyes widened, a rare, genuine look of absolute shock crossing his stoic features. The Mayfair Whisperer was an institution of terror among the elite. It had derailed political campaigns, broken engagements, and ruined the lives of dukes and prime ministers alike. If any of those four men dare to utter a single negative syllable about Lady Cecily in their gentlemen's clubs or their drawing-rooms, Nora continued, her voice turning as cold and hard as forged iron, I will use my paper to print the exact, excruciating details of Lord Stirling's pathetic debts, Sir Theodore's secret mistress, Captain Hale's treasonous profiteering, and Mr. Ashford's humiliating corporate failure. I will serialize their absolute destruction on the front page of every newsstand from London to Edinburgh. They know this, Your Grace, because I had copies of their ruined deeds sent to the paper's editor this afternoon with a warning attached. They are terrified. They will never speak her name again. Alan Foster, the titan of industry, a man who had manipulated the wealth of nations, was entirely speechless. He stared at the 24-year-old orphan in profound awe. She had not just protected his daughter. She had weaponized the very press that preyed upon them to create an impenetrable, permanent shield around his family. After a long, breathless silence, where the only sound was the crackle of the fire, the Duke looked down at the final, smaller document resting on the table. "And the last £500?" he asked, his voice barely above a reverent whisper. "That, Your Grace, is a deed to a small, independent bookshop in the heart of Bloomsbury," Nora said softly. The cold, calculating edge melted from her voice, replaced by a genuine shy smile that finally broke through her rigid professional facade. She looked down at her hands, suddenly vulnerable. "Purchased in my own name. I have loved my time here at Blackwood Manor, Your Grace. You and Lady Cecily saved me from the streets, but I do not wish to be a servant forever. I want to read. I want to learn. I use the final sum to buy my own freedom." The Duke looked from the legal deeds on the table to the brilliant, unassuming young woman standing before him in her plain black uniform. He saw the fierce, undeniable intellect, the unwavering loyalty, and the sheer, unyielding courage that the four aristocratic suitors lacked entirely. Alan Foster reached out. He bypassed the deeds, bypassed his glass of brandy, and gently took Nora's rough, working-class hand in his own. He bowed his head over it in a gesture of profound, absolute respect that he had never, not once in his life, offered to another living soul. "You shall not be a servant, Nora, not for another second," the Duke declared, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to break his stoic composure. "You shall be the manager of the Foster Estate's newly formed investment portfolio. You shall run your bookshop in Bloomsbury, and I will fund its expansion myself. But above all things, you will always, from this day until my last, be considered a member of this family." For the first time in her life, Nora Hayes did not fade into the shadows. She stood tall in the golden, flickering light of the chandeliers, a queen who had conquered a rotting empire with nothing but her wits, her heart, and a handful of sterling. The grand experiment of Alan Foster, the Duke of Somerset, ended not with a noble marriage, but with a profound revelation about the true nature of worth. Wealth, when placed in the hands of the arrogant and the corrupt, acted only as an accelerant to their ruin. Lord Stirling, Sir Theodore, Captain Hale, and Mr. Ashford allowed their greed to blind them, falling victim to traps built entirely of their own hubris. Yet it was the invisible, underestimated lady's maid who proved that true power does not lie in titles or bank accounts, but in loyalty, intellect, and the courage to act in the shadows. By securing Lady Cecily's independence, punishing the wicked, and seizing her own destiny, Nora shattered the rigid constraints of Victorian society. She proved definitively that while a title is inherited, nobility of spirit must be earned, and sometimes it can be bought for exactly £5,000